Um, okay, hello everybody. I am here with Graham Oppy, who is, of course, a leading philosopher of religion. Um, and I guess today I just wanted to talk a little bit about um, Dr. Oppy's thoughts on some issues related to philosophy of religion and so on. Um, so yeah, I guess that's why I'm always awkward with starting these interviews and stuff. But yeah, I think that's mostly it. So I guess I wanted to do I had the idea to have this conversation because I was reading a book that you had co-authored, sort of a written debate with a Christian philosopher of religion. The book was titled "Is There a God?" And in that book, what interested me was you sort of sketched out a particular version of a naturalistic theory that I'd like to talk a little bit about. Um, and I guess starting with that, I think the first and probably the most essential tenet that you mentioned of the sketch of a naturalistic theory that you laid out was the claim that according to your view, natural reality exhausts causal reality, which I think you cashed out as the claim that all causal entities are natural entities and all causal properties are natural properties. Um, and I guess I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, and particularly on the notion of what constitutes a natural property or a natural entity. And I guess I was wondering like how you articulate the difference between something that's natural and something that isn't natural, because I think a lot of people have concerns that the concept of naturalness is too vague and ill-defined to be helpful. And I was wondering what you sort of made of that.
So in philosophy, you get lots of these kinds of issues coming up where you use vocabulary that is pretty well understood, but trying to say exactly, right, trying to give an analysis of it or trying to say exactly what it is turns out to be extremely difficult. So, for example, as part of the kind of project of analytic epistemology, for a long time, people have tried to say what knowledge is. And the truth is that nobody has succeeded, right? Every account of knowledge that people have come up with faces counterexamples. So there is a question at the beginning here about whether the notion of the natural is in worse shape than, say, the notion of knowledge or cause or art or any of the things that analytic philosophers have tried to analyze. If you're asking me to give you an analysis of what natural is, I'm just going to say no fair, right? You give me the analyses of knowledge, art, and cause, and then come back to me, and I'll maybe try to comply with your request. Okay, so that's the first thing that I wanted to say. The second thing is that what I'm inclined to do is just to hand this question, the question about how we're going to settle what's natural and what isn't over to the natural and human sciences. So I'm going to say our best guide to the natural is just provided by what we get. So our best guide to natural reality is just what we get out of physics, chemistry, biochemistry, but it also includes history, psychology, and so on. And when, as I say in various places where I've discussed this, once you start thinking about that kind of typical examples of things that are not natural, we're not in any, and you ask people, okay, which of these are the natural things and which are the non-natural? People have no trouble doing the sorting. Just as by and large, if you ask, is this a case of knowledge or was there causation here or is this a work of art? People don't have trouble making the sorting, right? So that's a kind of short two-part answer to that question.
Okay, yeah. That seems fair. It seems like there's a lot of cases where we have a sort of familiar concept and it's easy to think of paradigm examples of things that are do and don't fall under that concept, but maybe precisely demarcating what exactly we define the concept as is can be difficult and maybe impossible to do. Um,
So, I mean, I could add one other thing, which is about how concepts about God fit into this, right? So, if you think about the location where you're going to find the natural properties instantiated, and we forget about the idea that there might be a multiverse and there might be other domains, and we just think about our universe and suppose that that's the domain of natural reality. It's pretty standard for theists to say, no, God's not located there. Not in any primary sense. God's transcendent. If you want to say that God exists everywhere, that gives you pantheism. Most Christians think of that as kind of beyond the pale, right? So it's not very controversial that God's going to turn out not to be a natural cause on this way of thinking about things as well, in a very sort of straightforward, intuitive sense, right? So the although there's lots of details and things to argue about, the natural entities are things that have spatiotemporal location and that are part of the causal web that sits within the spatiotemporal domain, right? So that would be, I think all of that's too quick. So I'm not going to offer that as an analysis, but it's still part of the how we go about classifying things. So when I ask you whether ghosts are natural, the question's going to be, are there any located anywhere in space-time? And the answer to that is no. The sciences sort of speak with one voice about that, right? And so ghosts will turn out not to be natural on this way of thinking about things.
yeah. And so with respect to the claim that um, natural reality exhausts causal reality, and I guess it might be helpful to just, as you sort of alluded to, um, you know, just in case anybody in the audience is like having trouble grasping the distinction, I mean, obviously like ghosts, gods, wizards, witches, magic, chi, all this stuff is obviously, familiar, non-natural stuff. And obviously like trees, particles, these are all natural things. Um,
Stars, galaxies, people, cars. I mean, you can go on endlessly listing the
yeah,
natural things.
exactly. Yeah.
There's a smaller list of the things that aren't natural, but if you think about things that just don't fall under the purview of any of the natural or social sciences, and for example, I mean, ghosts are a good example. There just is no scientific study of ghosts, right? So,
Yeah. Um, and so then, with respect to the claim that natural reality exhausts causal reality, what do you think is the significance of saying, or could you maybe distinguish between saying that natural reality exists causal reality versus natural reality just exists reality, like simpliciter? Like, could you sort of spell out the difference between those two claims and why that's significant?
so so although this isn't universal, there are lots of theists who think that God is cause of natural reality. I mean, that's a very standard um, theistic view. And were that so, there would be causes that didn't fit within natural reality. There would be non-natural causes. Right. So if we think about causal reality, that's just the sum of all the causes. And what's in there, um, well, opinion varies about what's in there. If you're a theist of the fairly standard kind, you're going to think that there's some non-natural causing because there's God's causing the existence of natural reality. Whereas if you're a naturalist, you're going to think, no, all the causing that there is falls within the natural domain. And so I started with the idea of thinking about, just think about the sum of all causing. That's causal reality. And now we're going to have an argument about what all is in there, right? And naturalists and theists, at least of the kind that I was imagining, are going to disagree about what kinds of causes there are.
Okay.
I don't know. Does that help to set the?
Yeah, yeah. And it's also I think helpful to note like there are common philosophical views that maybe posit non-natural things, but they're not really causal natural things. Like maybe like you're a Platonist about numbers and you think that, you know, numbers are this abstract metaphysical thing, but they don't really causally interact with, you know, the rest of the causal order. And so maybe those kinds of entities wouldn't be ruled out by the view that natural reality exhausts causal reality.
Right. So I want to leave it as an open question for naturalists to argue about whether they're abstract objects. Right. That's not part of what has to enter into the sort of this primary characterization about the dispute about causal matters between theists and naturalists. I mean, there are theists who don't believe in abstract objects of any kind. There are other theists who think that really the kind of the moment when it all went wrong for kind of the Christian hegemony in the West was when people moved away from realism about universals to nominalism, right? So that people like Occam turn out to be kind of big villains in the kind of history of Western thought. As far as I'm concerned, that debate is a kind of in-house debate for, on the one hand, theists, and on the other hand, naturalists to prosecute amongst themselves. It's not significant for the dispute about whether we should be theists or naturalists.
And so where do you think, because it seems like the primary challenge to naturalism then is going to be theistic or religious in some sense, right? So God is obviously non-natural, a non-natural causal entity. And then, you know, if you believe in God, there's often other things like angels and so on that also might be causal. And so where do you think you know, theistic philosophers go wrong to posit these entities?
So maybe I'm not sure how to answer that
Mhm.
question. Uh, so, for example, suppose that you're a theistic philosopher and you believe not just um, in God, but you're a Christian philosopher, and you have some beliefs about the accuracy of the Bible on various matters, then it seems to be consistent. Sorry, I better turn this off. Um, it seems to be consistent with your beliefs that you're going to end up believing in angels and demons. Maybe. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's required, but it seems consistent. Um, so it's not obvious that you just want to say, well, look, you couldn't have reasons to believe that there are angels or that there are demons or whatever, or that somehow or other it would have to be irrational for you to end up doing that. What I'm going to argue is that it's perfectly permissible for somebody to pursue the kind of line of thinking that I pursue and end up preferring naturalism to theism on something like the following grounds. That if you think about everything that's agreed between theists and naturalists, and that's almost everything. And then you think about the resources that are required by naturalists and theists, and you think about what's explained by theism and naturalism with respect to all the stuff that they agree about. It turns out that naturalism is better because it's slightly simpler, it commits you to less, and it explains everything as well as theism does. And so it's perfectly permissible to make the judgment that naturalism is the better view. So that's the position that I've defended. I don't say that it's impermissible to judge another way. It's a very complicated judgment. There are lots and lots of things to take into account, and it's not straightforward determining whether what makes it the case that one worldview is simpler than another, and it's not and it's not straightforward. It's controversial determining whether certain things are explained on a given worldview. So when you said where do they go wrong, um, I'm not inclined to answer that directly. I'm going to tell you why I think naturalism is a better position than theism, but I'm not going to expect that I'm going to persuade theists that
Mhm.
that's the case.
Yeah, so it seems like your view is, we want to have a worldview or a theory that, strikes the right balance of explaining a lot of phenomena while at the same time not postulating more than is necessary to explain the phenomena that we're trying to explain. And it seems like your view is that, naturalism is simpler than theism because naturalism just posits the natural reality that we live in, whereas, maybe theism posits that plus a god that created all that, plus maybe other things as well, sometimes, depending on the view you want to take. And yet there's not really anything or anything significant that you think that theism would be able to explain that naturalism wouldn't be able to explain roughly as well. Do you think that's like an accurate
Yeah,
portrayal?
so that's pretty accurate. I mean, I think that all you need is the judgment that overall the explanatory job is done just as well by naturalism as by theism. So you could allow that there are some points where theism seems to have an advantage while still thinking that naturalism wins out overall. Obviously, there's a tricky issue here about how you kind of partition the data together. So, for example, if you just consider, suppose your only data point is that there's somebody who believes in God, right? And you've got no other data whatsoever that's relevant, then you've got some reason to think that there's a God, right? Just right. So, but nobody's going to think that that data point is something that you should assess on its own. At the very least, you should collect together the opinions of everybody on this matter. And then it turns out that it's a mess, the opinions all over the place. And you can't, from just looking at a survey of opinion, doesn't tell you anything about what you should believe because there's thousands of gods that people have believed in over time and space. Nothing stands out as kind of uncontroversial here about the believing, right? And so once you've partitioned the data in the right way, you see that you don't get something that favors one side over the other. Or if it favors one side, it's going to favor the naturalist side, right? Because everybody's going to have to think that most of the opinion is false.
Mhm.
Um, and so you've got to, if you treat your own opinion as being correct, you've got to think that there's something distinctive about your opinion. Well, what's distinctive about the naturalist is just that when we're not going beyond what's required by naturalism, right? Whereas anybody else is going beyond it in a certain way, but they're being very selective about it because they're thinking that they're getting it right and everybody else is getting it wrong. So maybe that favors naturalism a little bit.
And so the second component that I'd heard you mention in your writing of this sort of sketch of naturalism or the naturalistic theory that you accept is the idea that mindedness is late and local. And that seems fairly straightforward. I think the idea is we have this concept of, consciousness and of a mind. And you're saying that conscious minds are like a relatively recently evolved development in causal history, and that conscious minds only exist in some local part of the universe. Um, and famously, there are other schools of thought, such as idealism or maybe panpsychism. And people who believe in those theories believe that mental the mental is not late and local, but rather that the mental pervades everything across time and space. So maybe either everything has consciousness or everything exists within consciousness and is like a content of consciousness. So, why do you prefer the view that consciousness is and mindedness is late and local as opposed to being more pervasive across time and space?
So I've argued this perhaps most clearly in connection with idealism, right? If you suppose that mind is somehow fundamental, then there's something that you have to explain, namely where all of these states of mind that you're supposing that there are, what explains them and what explains their content. If you're Barclay, for example, and you think that, and let's forget about theism for a minute, and so imagining that God's not in the picture, then what you're supposing is that every mental state is just an uncaused existence, right? And that all of its properties are just unexplained, right? Now, that's an incredibly expensive theory compared to, say, the identity theory, say, a naturalistic theory, where there's a causal explanation for all of the features of mental states. And so it just strikes me as completely obvious that if this is our choice, you should be a physicalist or a materialist or a naturalist, something of that stripe, rather than an idealist, because the idealism is kind of maximally complicated. Now, you might try to get around this, right, by saying, no, we're going to have God, and God causes all the contents of the mental states. But then we're going to have to suppose that God has a relevant intention for each of the things that you're supposing is a primitive feature. And that theory isn't going to turn out to be simpler than the naturalist theory, which just supposes there's a world that's causing the relevant features. Right. So that's kind of the take on idealism. For panpsychism, it seems to me that there are extreme difficulties in understanding how you can put minds together to get minds, right? There's that kind of issue about panpsychism, about how the the little minds, the minds of the electrons, get put together to make the minds of things like us. But I also don't think that there's really any explanatory value in postulating minds for electrons. I just don't see. I don't see any data that's being explained by that. It just seems like kind of redundant, unnecessary stuff. So again, I'm really arguing on grounds of simplicity,
Mhm,
in connection with panpsychism as well, which is
mhm.
what you would have been, I guess, is what you would have expected me to say, given the kind of method that I'm recommending for trying to make decisions between worldviews or to assess their comparative merits.
So while we're on the topic of the mind, you mentioned identity theory, um, and how that's the sort of view of the mind that you accept. Um, and I take it that that's sort of course, if I mischaracterize, feel free
Yeah.
to correct me. I think that the view that you express is sort of the view that mental phenomenon is identical with certain physical phenomenon, namely phenomena that goes on in the brain, and is not something which is like separate from or above and beyond physical phenomena or brain processes, as many people suppose. So, for an example, an identity theorist might say that the mental phenomena of pain is just the firing of C fibers in the brain, in the same way that water is just H2O. Like, we're just using different terminology to describe the same thing or the same phenomenon. um, and so I'm wondering if, I guess what sort of, you mentioned that you think certain considerations count in favor of that view relative to something like idealism or panpsychism. I'm wondering, what considerations do you think count in favor of the identity theory as opposed to something like, dualism? Um, and I'm wondering how you account for what people sometimes refer to as qualia. So I think, for people in the audience, I think qualia is just a sort of a fancy way of talking about sort of subjective experience. So, like, the idea is that there's a certain irreducibly subjective or qualitative, like what it's like ness element to mental phenomena that seems to defy physical explanation or reduction. Um, and so, yeah, I guess I was wondering what you make of that and how you account for that um, in terms of in terms of identity
Yeah.
theory.
Right. So, I mean, I guess the first thing I'll say is the the view is going to be a kind of restricted view. So pain for humans will be a certain kind of thing. Pain for androids or aliens or um, cephalopods might be something else. But in humans, anatomically, we're all the same. Uh, right? We have been for, I don't know, 200,000 years. Our anatomy hasn't changed. The anatomy of the brain hasn't changed. Um, what it is for people to have experiences is just for them for certain types of things to be happening in their brains, and to know what it's like to have a certain kind of experience um, requires you to have the experience. And in order to have the experience, you have to have the processing going on in your brain. So that's in a very, I mean, very compactly is the explanation of the sort of what it's like thing. You can't know what Vegemite tastes like unless you eat some and you do that with your brain functioning properly, right? And then you will experience the taste of Vegemite. But that experience is just a matter of certain things happening internally, physical things or more broadly natural things. I mean, the level of explanation won't be physical, it'll be chemical or biological or, whatever.
Mhm.
So once you've got that view, that any kind of dualist view is going to seem unnecessarily complicated because you're imagining that there's something else, a mind in which experiences are happening, and there are causal transactions between the mind and the brain because all the things that the naturalists suppose are going on in the brain, dualists accept that's all happening. But you've added all this extra stuff, which I'm inclined to think is completely unnecessary, right? If you make the identification, you're committed to way less than if you imagine that there's these two entirely separate things with causation connecting them.
Okay,
Right?
and
So,
so
so, 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 so there's good reason, I think, to be the kind of identity theorist that Jack Smart was. Where I mean, Smart's sort of formula was that was to talk about um, things going on in your brain. Right? So he didn't he didn't suggest that what's going on in there is processing in the kind of sense that you might have processing in your laptop. It was just there's stuff, neural stuff happening. And for that to be happening in you, given that you're connected to the environment in the right kind of way and you've got the right kind of history and so on, is just what it is to have experiences of certain kinds. And we can talk about what it's like. I mean, our language is kind of very useful, right, for describing internal states. So, you go to the doctor and sort of what sort of pain have you got, right? Is it a sharp shooting pain? Is it a dull throat? And so on. All of that stuff makes sense, but we're just talking about stuff that's going on inside our heads. We're not talking about states in some immaterial thing in some other realm that's somehow causally connected to our brains.
mhm. Okay, and so how would you sort of deal with the claim that, I mean, to go for a famous example, like if we think about the physical facts surrounding, what happens in the brain and so on, when we view like the color red, some people are going to claim that any physical description of what's going on in the brain when you see the color red is just still going to leave out, this what it's actually like to see the color red. So if we had like, a colorblind scientist who knew all the physical facts about the brain and what happens in brains when they see the color red, but then, they gain the ability to see color and now they see the color red, like they've gained some new information, or there's something about the experience of seeing the color red that was left out. Knowledge about what that experience is like was left out even by knowing all the physical facts about the brain and so on. Do you think that, how do you deal with that sort of objection to the identity theory?
So, on the assumption that the person can't kind of manipulate their brain so that they can have experiences of red in the absence of red things, which isn't, after all, ruled out, right? So, for Mary in the room, if she's that good of a scientist, she might be able to put herself into the states, in which case she will know what red looks like, even though she's never seen it. But setting that to one side, one of the things that we think goes along with knowing what red things look like is an ability to be able to directly look at things and identify their colors. Now, of course, in a way, because Mary's this super scientist, she already knows when she looks at things what their colors are, right? Because she's omniscient, right? So she can tell when she looks at, right? I mean, yes, the room's black and white somehow, but she can, you can show her on a black and white movie the world and point to anything you like, and she knows exactly what the colors are because she's omniscient, right? But what she can't do is just by looking say what the colors of things are. There's an ability that she lacks. The ability is the correlate of the knowing what it's like. And so there is something that she gets when that gets switched on in her head. But she's not, I mean, it's important to understand what it is that she's getting.
Okay, so the Zoom meeting got cut off because I did not pay for the premium version of Zoom, and they will only let me have about 40 minutes per Zoom meeting. So we are going to attempt to pick up where we left off talking about the identity theory. And I think Mary's room was the last thing we were talking about.
Yeah. So I what I was suggesting was that there isn't really any new propositional knowledge that Mary gains when her color vision switches on, right? She already knows all the propositions. She knows which things are red, and she knows which things look red to which people in which circumstances and so on. Because she's omniscient. She's got all that stuff down. What happens is that she acquires something that we might describe as know-how. So it's knowledge of a certain kind. Um, she acquires the ability to identify the colors of things just by looking at them without recourse to the theory that she's got that independently tells her what the colors of things, what the colors of all the things are. And it's tricky because talk about knowledge isn't just about propositional knowledge, knowing that. There's knowing how and knowing what and so on. And in some sense, she acquires some new knowledge, but she doesn't acquire knowledge in a sense that's threatening to naturalists or physicalists or whatever.
Okay, and so it seems like yeah, so it seems like, the non-physicalist wants to say that, it seems like there's something new that Mary gains when she begins to see color that she didn't know before, despite knowing all the physical facts. And that proves that there's some like experiential knowledge that she gains, and that there's some experiential knowledge above and beyond all physical knowledge and physical facts. But it seems like you're saying on the physicalist view, we can sort of accommodate, I guess, the intuition that she gains something new because what she gains is an ability, like the ability to, know that things are red just by looking at them and so on. And her gaining that ability from seeing color is completely consistent with physicalism.
Right. So she gains some know-how, that's for sure. And that seems to be enough to explain the intuition that there's some new knowledge here, right?
Mm.
I know the physicalist doesn't have to deny that, but what the physicalist will deny is that there's any propositional knowledge that she
Mhm.
gains.
Mhm. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And so I guess moving to another component of the naturalistic worldview that you had sketched out is the claim that, well, another component, I guess, of that naturalistic worldview is the claim that nothing is divine. Um, and so you cash that out as saying that there's no part of causal reality that's divine or sacred or worthy of worship.
Yeah.
Um, so, there are some worldviews according to which, maybe like a sort of pantheistic worldview might be something like this, where they basically agree that there's just, like natural reality. There's not really a God above and beyond natural reality. But, maybe they'll throw in the claim that natural reality itself is imbued with divinity in some fashion or another. And I guess that claim has always seemed sort of ambiguous to me. I'm not really sure exactly what that's supposed to mean. So I guess how do you cash out that distinction and why do you think we should well, yeah, why do you reject the claim that there is some divine or sacred component to natural causal reality?
Right. So maybe there'll be people who want to say that they're naturalists and also pantheists or panentheists, or I mean, there's a range of possible views here, and so throwing this in as part of what I'm taking to characterize naturalism is probably a bit sneaky, really. It's a way of characterizing my kind of view, and whether you want to think that it's that somehow or other somebody who thinks that there's just natural reality but it's divine, whether you should think of them as being a naturalist or not is something that we could argue about further. Um, I can't see any reason for thinking that natural reality is divine, right? And so I think that it's a kind of advantage of my view that we that we do away with that claim. I don't see any sort of theoretical advantage that you would get from being a pantheist or a panentheist. Um, I'm not sure that I've answered everything you wanted to ask me there, though. Um,
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. It almost seems like adding, I guess, the property of divinity to natural reality is just, similar to theism or idealism. It's just sort of inflating our view of the world. It's adding like new properties to our picture of the world that we don't really get any advantage or explanatory power from postulating.
right. So that's the view. Yeah. Um,
Okay, yeah. Yeah, and so one other thing that I don't think you add in the book that I had referred to at the beginning of the interview. I don't think that you mentioned this as a part of what you think constitutes naturalism, but you had gone on to discuss the issue in your explication of the sort of version of naturalism that you accept, which is the topic of modality. And for if people in the audience don't know what modality is, it's kind of just when we talk about modal notions, we're talking about ideas like what's possible, what's necessary, what's contingent, sort of ideas related. I think probably possibility is the most familiar. modal concept, things that could happen or couldn't happen or must necessarily happen, and so on. Yeah, just those sorts of concepts. Um, and I guess I was wondering, because a lot has been made of the metaphysics of modality, um, and these sorts of questions around what are the truth makers for modal statements. David Lewis famously answered that what makes the statement X is possible true is that there's some concretely existing possible world where X happens. And so the truth makers for modal statements are, what goes on in possible worlds. And so I guess what's your sort of picture of modality, both in terms of what possibilities there are and in terms of what are the sort of truth makers of modal statements and claims about possibility and so on?
So, so this is complicated. It's complicated because I want to start by drawing a distinction between kind of metaphysical modality and something that's more, people talk about epistemic modality, but it's something that's more doxastic, that has to do with reasonable belief. So the question is, the kind of big question is, what range of possibilities should you think there are? What range of possibilities should you think there are in particular that bear on metaphysics, right? And some people have a view that as far as metaphysics goes, we should be very permissive about the possibilities. Anything that you can conceive coherently is metaphysically possible. So that's a very sort of expansive view. I'm at the other end of that scale. I think that you should only postulate the possibilities that you need, right? And that you should keep your range of possibilities as small as is consistent with the data. So my view about modality then looks very different. I think that if we're going to talk about possible worlds share history with and laws with the actual world and diverge from it only because chances play out differently. What you need possibilities for is chances. If our world was deterministic, there would be no other possibilities than what's actual. It's only because there's indeterminism that you get a range of possibilities. Now that's very different from the view that says if you can imagine it, it's a possibility. Uh, so, so I think it's quite hard to work out what's possible. If you go far enough back in history and you imagine the quantum events, quantum indeterminacy playing out differently, it's hard to judge. I mean, we can't work out how things would be now. So it's quite hard to determine what is metaphysically possible. But it's fairly straightforward to rule out lots of things that seem, in some sense, conceivable, right? Um, so that's the story about metaphysical modality. When it comes to the kind of doxastic question about what can be reasonably believed, I think there's not much by way of constraint there. So that turns out to be closer, I mean, it turns out closer to being the other view, the view that sort of whatever you can conceive is possible. But it's not possible in a way that bears on reality. It's just possible in a way that bears on what is permissible for people to believe.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's maybe the most important thing. I'm not sure I responded to everything in your question.
Mm. No, yeah, I think that so would you say that, because I feel like in one very common picture of modality, you have like, maybe things like physical modality or and then you have like metaphysical modality, and then you have maybe like logical modality, right? So something might be logically possible but metaphysically impossible in the classic picture. um and it seems like what you're saying is that um, all of the possibilities there are is exhausted by what's metaphysically possible, and then what's metaphysically possible is determined by um, you know, some state of affairs that shares some causal history with the actual world, but branched off because of chance. And so, would you say that logical possibilities that are nonetheless metaphysically impossible are just therefore not actual possibilities at all?
Um, so the notion of logical possibility is a kind of interesting thing. And I didn't talk about this in my what I said so far. Uh, the I mean, what we do have to do really is go back to talk about something like predicate calculus. You have to talk about logic. Um, so the logical truths are things that are true in virtual form. What that means is that we hold fixed the meanings of the logical terms and we let everything else vary. And if no matter how we interpret the non-logical vocabulary, the thing comes out true, then it's a logical truth. But that just means that when we're talking about logical possibility, we're just talking about, you know, imagine how you, so does this sentence express a logical possibility? All we mean is hold fixed only the meanings of the logical terms. Now let all the meanings of everything else vary. Can it ever come out that this expresses a truth? Right. So to pick an example that's slightly controversial, but you know, the all bachelors. Sorry, there's a bachelor that is married, right? That's logically possible because just reinterpret the words bachelor and unmarried, uh, replace them with something else, and of course you can come up with a sentence um, that expresses a truth. That notion of possibility has nothing at all to do with metaphysics, right? And it's fine to talk. I mean, you can talk about logical possibilities if you want, right? But that's a really specialized notion uh, that properly belongs to logic and doesn't really have anything to do with the kinds of discussion that we've been having to this point.
Okay, and so, it seems like so you would say that the only sort of the only sort of possibilities that have, metaphysical implications would be, metaphysical modality. Um, and maybe
So
the other things we can just cash out in some doxastic sense. Sorry, go ahead.
so I guess that's sort of right. However, I mean, think about so I talked about quantum chances, but think about something else. Think about say rolling a die, right? And we're going to bet on what it comes up as, and then we want to know what are fair odds here, right? Um, it's definitely going to be the case that the betting behavior makes sense, whether or not the roll of the dice is deterministic, right? So there's a sense in which we might want to talk about possibilities here that's sort of the following kind. For all that you've got reason to believe, it's roughly equally likely that it's going to come up each of these six ways. It could come up this way, it could come up that way, it could come up that way. But there, what we're talking about is clearly something to do with our ignorance. It's not about the nature of reality, right? It's a way of dealing with our ignorance. We don't actually know whether dice rolls are indeterministic because although plausibly they're near enough to deterministic. Um, but in any case, we don't know enough about the laws and the initial conditions to be able to do the calculation so that when we see the die spinning, we can say, okay, it's going to come up 6, right? That's just a question about our ignorance. So there's talk about possibilities and probabilities that's just to do with our ignorance. That's not metaphysical either, right? So, but there can be a kind of fact of the matter about what you should do. Like if you don't, supposing that it's a kind of fair die, if you don't apportion your probabilities in the right way, someone else can just take your money from you, right? So so long as you don't want your money to be just taken from you, there's a kind of rational way to respond. So there's something objective here, but it's not something about the structure of reality. It's not metaphysical. The objectivity that belongs to a different domain. It's kind of what's rational for you to do or something like that.
Okay, and so it seems like if I'm thinking about this right, there's one way of talking about possibility where we're just talking about like something that could be the case relative to our state of knowledge.
Yeah.
Um, so something that might be the case in terms of like it is or isn't the case, right? And maybe it's already set in stone, but we don't know yet, and so it could be either one. And then there's this
From
notion
our
of
point of view,
yeah, right, exactly.
for all we know, or
Mhm.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's a more metaphysically robust kind of possibility, like a genuine possibility, like there's a chance that this could have happened. And what kind of possibilities exist in that sense is going to be exhausted by um, uh, what quantum indeterminacy and what our best physical theories tell us there's a chance of happening.
Right. And it's controversial whether we should interpret quantum mechanics so that it gives us chances. Um, my hunch is that that's the right way to go, but I could be wrong about that. And if I was, then I'd want to reconsider the whole story that I've been telling, I think. Uh, but of course, people who think that we have libertarian freedom think that there's chance in just this kind of sense, right? So it doesn't have to be that you think that if quantum mechanics turns out not to give us chances, then we have to reconsider. You might think, well, we can be very confident that there's a certain kind of um, chanciness in our decision making or something like that, of a kind that the kind of traditional libertarian um, ideas required.
Mhm. Yeah, and so okay, and so I imagine the motivation for the sort of view that you've described is in line with what we've been discussing, is the sort of the idea that we shouldn't postulate more than we need to actually characterize the world. And it seems like maybe the only possibilities we need in the metaphysically robust sense rather than in just the doxastic sense are the possibilities that are given to us by like our physical theories that imply the existence of chances and so on. Is that sort of the idea?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So that sounds right to me. And of course, there is a constraint that you want to explain as much as possible, right? So uh, you might think that that you could find some other reasons for postulating more, but I'm skeptical that you do. I think that that if there are quantum chances and we're postulating them, then we've covered the possibilities that we need for theorizing.
Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah, that all makes sense. I guess I think the one last thing that I had in mind to discuss was um, some of those non-causal, non-natural entities which are often proposed abstract objects, namely, things like properties or universals. Many philosophers, metaphysicians will say that in addition to particular things, say, in addition to a Coke can and an apple and all of these red things, we should also admit into our sort of metaphysical view in the world this extra metaphysical category of like a property, where we don't just have a red Coke can and a red apple, but we have a red Coke can, a red apple, and they both instantiate this other thing that's above and beyond both individual things, called like the property of redness. Um, and so, what do you sort of make of that? How do you think of those sorts of things?
So I have a fairly open mind on the dispute between those people who believe in universals and those people who believe in tropes and those people who are nominalists and want to do without both categories. My kind of inclination is to go the last way and to do without, because that's the kind of general Occamist approach, to try to do without and then see what the consequences are. I'm not sure that you can do without both universals and tropes. In the book, I try to suggest a way of reconstruing talk about properties so that you're kind of allowed to talk that way, but it doesn't have any metaphysical commitment. I'm not sure how successful that is. I haven't really worked it out in full detail. But that's definitely the direction that my sympathies go. Right. I do think that, I mean, this is kind of a general point about what I did. I wanted to set out our worldview in as much detail as I could. There are lots of places where I'm really not sure that the worldview is right, but I wanted one so that we have something to talk about. And I hope that Kenny would set out in corresponding detail his worldview, and that would give us lots to talk about, because then we could look at all the different ways in which our views varied. And that would, from my point of view, would help to sort of make the point about how difficult this process of worldview comparison is. Even the first step, trying to set out a worldview, makes you realize how many things there are where you actually kind of really aren't sure which way you want to go. It seems kind of modular. You could imagine keeping most of what I said in the book, but investing in tropes instead, or keeping most of what I say in the book, but giving up on the kind of moral realism, or keeping most of and so on, for lots of stuff. But in the end, what we're going to be interested in is fully elaborated worldviews. Those are the things that we're going to be comparing, because it's only there that you kind of genuinely get to see how the trade-off between simplicity and explanatory power is really playing out. If you restrict your attention to some smaller thing, it's got no consequences for the bigger picture, right? It's just, remember that point earlier about if my only data point is that someone believes that there's a God, right? That just has no consequences for the wider dispute, even though in that circumstance you would have some reason, perhaps fairly small, but some reason to lean towards there being a God.
Yeah, and so it seems like what you mentioned about universals, I think if I remember correctly, sort of generalizes to your views about most abstract objects, which is that they're um, sort of useful linguistic devices that don't really carry any ontological implications. Like, talking about something like properties. And if people in the audience are familiar with a more similar view known as deflationism about truth, this will sort of be a familiar concept where we use language of like truth or properties not because by talking about properties, we're actually picking out like this metaphysically distinct thing. But just because that talk allows us to say things in a more concise way that would be um, harder to talk about, like without the language of properties and so on. Um,
So it's
and
probably
yeah,
worth illustrating this with the point about truth. So Quine's view about truth was that, if you just say such and such is true, you might as well have just said such and such. But that's not where the concept of truth finds its utility. There are things like everything the Pope says is true, which um, you can't unpack in a straightforward way, right? I mean, if everything the Pope says is true, then from that, there's an infinite number of claims that you can infer. If the Pope says that there are green hyenas, then there are green hyenas, and so on. And you could have, if you were able to, had infinite resources, you could have said something that was effectively equivalent to what Quine said without using the notion of truth. But truth gets its utility because it enables us to say these infinite things very compactly. And so my thought was that you can probably say something similar about talk about properties, right? That what makes property talk, so talk involving the word property, useful, is that it enables us to say things that otherwise would be infinite, right? Um, so like so-and-so, Napoleon had all the attributes, had all the properties of a great general, right? The idea is that you can say that without knowing, without having an exhaustive list of properties and then being able to go through and for each of them say, this property is the property that a great general will have or whatever. So you get, again, if you try to spell it out, it would be like trying to spell out everything the Pope says is true. Trying to spell that out without using the word true is very difficult. Trying to fill out Napoleon has all the attributes of a great general, has all the properties of a great general, is going to be really hard to fill out without the word property. But it doesn't mean that we're making some commitment to some feature of reality, properties, right? It's a kind of linguistically useful device that enables us to talk about things that we otherwise couldn't talk about. That was my thought. I don't know whether you can make it work or not, but that was the idea.
yeah, that's interesting because I feel like that gets around sort of both of the, when people propose something like Platonism about properties and they say properties are this extra metaphysical category and they exist not spatiotemporally and so on. Obviously, one of the issues with that is sort of your having your theory is thereby becoming sort of ontologically profligate. You're postulating extra entities, but also there's this sort of issue of an epistemic gap, like, if these things sort of exist non-spatiotemporally, how can we come to know about them and talk about them? And it seems like built into your view pretty clearly is a story about why we use this language, and it's, because it's useful and so on. um, so yeah, that makes sense to me for sure. um, I think that's I think we've covered about everything that I had planned to cover, and we have about 8 minutes left of the Zoom meeting. So yeah, I think unless there was anything else you want to add, I think that we've gotten to most of the things I had wanted to get to.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything I want to add. And I think you made a good choice of topics to talk about. You picked out some of the kind of central and controversial things in the book.